The Bears on Hemlock Mountain. Chapter 1. About Jonathan. Jonathan lived in a gray stone farmhouse at the foot of Hemlock Mountain. Now, Hemlock Mountain was not a mountain at all. It was a hill, and not a very big one. But someone had started calling it Hemlock Mountain, and the name had stuck. Now everyone talked about going over Hemlock Mountain. It was the year when Jonathan was 8 that he went over Hemlock Mountain. He was a fine big boy for his age. That was why his mother could send him over the mountain all by himself. The winter had been a cold one. Even now, in early spring, there was snow on the ground. The birds and the squirrels and the rabbits had a hard time finding everything to eat. So every day, Jonathan remembered to feed them. Jonathan loved animals and birds. He knew the tracks that each one made in the snow. The small creatures could not find enough to eat, but it was not so with Jonathan's aunts and uncles and cousins. All they had to do was to come to the Greystone farmhouse, and there was always plenty of food. Jonathan's mother was a fine cook, and all the aunts, uncles, and cousins knew it. They liked to drop in for supper and to sit around the table in front of the big fireplace. Such good suppers! There would be roast chicken or roast duck or roast goose, brown and done to a turn. There would be potatoes and turnips and carrots and corn. And of course, there would be pies, pumpkin and apple and squash. While for those who like cookies, there were crisp brown ones cut into every shape you can imagine. Jonathan's mother liked company, but sometimes, once in a while, she wished they did not have so much of it, or that the aunts and uncles and cousins were not quite so hungry. Chapter 2. Young Uncle James. Jonathan was very fond of his uncles. He was fond of his cousins and his aunts. It was pretty fine for a boy to have so many uncles and aunts. If all his uncles and aunts stood side by side, they would go all the way from the house to the gate, or very nearly. He liked all the uncles, but best of all, he liked young Uncle James. Young Uncle James was only 14 years old, so he and Jonathan were friends. Young Uncle James had eyes that saw and ears that heard. "Look," he would say to Jonathan, "look by that tree stump is a cottontail." Then he and Jonathan were very still. They could see the little brown rabbit washing his face and his ears. "Listen," young Uncle James would say. "There is a song sparrow. Do you hear what he says?" Then he and Jonathan were very still. They would see the song sparrow singing on the branch, and the song sparrow was saying over and over, "Put on the kettle, kettle, kettle." Once Jonathan and Uncle James went down to the brook. It was late in the day and the shadows were long. "What are we going to see?" asked Jonathan. "Wait and you will find out," said Uncle James. So they waited and listened. It was hard for Jonathan to keep so still. They waited and listened, and at last a raccoon came down to the brook. He had an apple in his mouth. "Look," said Uncle James. "Look carefully, Jonathan." Jonathan looked. A raccoon took the apple in his two front paws. He dipped it in the water and dipped it and dipped it and dipped it again. Coons like their food wet, said Uncle James. That was the way of it. Every day, Jonathan and Uncle James listened and looked. They never threw sticks at the animals or scared the birds. Soon all the animals and birds were their friends. The squirrel was the best friend of all. He came very near to get nuts from Jonathan. Uncle James, said Jonathan, did you ever see a bear? Well, now, said Uncle James, looking important, I believe I did. But it was years ago, Jonathan. How many years ago? Before you were born. Yes, it was before you were born. I would like to see a bear, said Jonathan. I would rather see a bear than anything in the world. Maybe you will, said Uncle James. That was all he said. But Jonathan kept on thinking about bears. Chapter 3. The Iron Pot. Now, if there are lots of aunts and uncles, there are likely to be lots of new cousins. Jonathan kept having new cousins all the time. It happened that a new small cousin of Jonathan's were being christened. So, of course, all the aunts and uncles and older cousins were going to christening. Afterwards, so they thought, it would be fine to have supper in the grey stone farmhouse. It was fine when relatives came in ones and twos, or threes and fours, or even fives and six. But this particular time, 20 of them were coming. 20 of them, said Jonathan's mother. Whatever shall we do? Give them a good big hearty stew, said Jonathan's father. Fill them up with it, and then give them cookies. That should be enough. It's a fine idea, said Jonathan's mother as she rolled out the cookie dough and cut it into stars and bells, hearts and flowers, rabbits and birds, and a dozen other things. A fine idea, but where in all the world shall I get a pot big enough to make a stew for 23 people? For of course you and Jonathan and I must be counted in. I should think so, Jonathan's father said, and I remember I am very hungry this cold weather. He certainly was. But then he was a big man and worked hard on the farm. Even in the wintertime he worked hard, for there were the cows to be milked and all the other animals to be fed. There was wood to be cut. This kept the big fire going so that Jonathan's mother could cook all the good things the family liked to eat. Jonathan helped carry in the wood. Jonathan's mother kept thinking about the stew and about the pots that would be big enough to cook it. I know, she said to Jonathan as he brought in an armful of wood. Your Aunt Emma, over across Hemlock Mountain, has the biggest iron pot you ever laid eyes on. I never laid eyes on it, said Jonathan. Then you are going to, said his mother. Your father is much too busy to go for it, but you can go and fetch it. Me, said Jonathan, all alone? They say there are bears on Hemlock Mountain. Stuff and nonsense, said his mother. Many's the time I've seen over Hemlock Mountain, and not a bear did I see. Your Uncle James might have been telling you stories. Besides, if there were bears, they'd be asleep this time of year. And besides, there are no bears. But it's a long way and the pot is heavy, Jonathan said, and bears wake up in the spring. You are a big boy now, his mother told him. Get on your warm coat and your warm cap and your warm muffler and go quickly, for you must be back before it's dark. Tomorrow early I shall start in the stew. So Jonathan put on his coat and his muffler and pulled his warm cap down over his ears. He filled his pocket full of nuts for the squirrels on Hemlock Mountain, and he took some breadcrumbs for the birds. Then Jonathan went trampling to the gate, his boots making big footprints in the snow. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Then suddenly he turned and went back. "Ma," he said when his mother opened the door, "will you give me some carrots?" "Some carrots? Whatever for?" "For the rabbits on Hemlock Mountain. I have nuts for the squirrels and breadcrumbs for the birds. Now I want carrots for the rabbits." "Well, of course," said his mother, and she gave him a bunch of carrots. Then she went to the cookie jar and brought out a handful of cookies. "And these are for you," she said, "just in case you should be late coming over the mountain. But you must not be late, for it still gets dark early." "Thank you," said Jonathan, and he put the cookies in his pocket. "I won't be late, because maybe there are bears on Hemlock Mountain." And then he was off again, crunch, 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 in his big boots, making big footprints all the way to the gate. Now I will continue to chapter 4 on the next video.